They'd mocked her even before she stepped off the train. Mail-order brides weren't rare in that stretch of the Wyoming territory, but they usually arrived young, wide-eyed, clumsy in town etiquette, but eager to marry a homestead. Clarabelamy was none of those things. She was nearing 30, hard-eyed, too quiet, and she came wearing a black bonnet that covered her brow like a widow in mourning, though no one ever saw her weep. She'd written ahead that she wanted land, not a husband. The letter, hastily read by the town clerk and handed to John R. McKittrick, a horse breeder with a rotting roof and 3 debts due, had somehow turned into an arrangement. He offered her his old parcel west of the dried creek bed, plus his half-built barn, in exchange for a quick wedding. But when she arrived and saw the collapsed structure, she just stood beside it in silence, then said no and walked north. The settlement had assumed she'd either crawl back or vanish into the hills. Instead, she camped 2 nights under a rock bluff, then hired 2 Shoshone boys to help her drag logs, mud, and stone up toward a ravine nobody used, a wind-scoured bowl where snow collected early and melted late. Her first week, she built a fence. Second week, she dug. And on the third, she began a structure that looked to every man in Sweet Hollow like lunacy. A barn sunk 3 feet into the ground, with stone walls up to the waist, a slanted sod roof, and no visible door. "She's building a crypt," someone said. "She's got her dead husband in mind," said another. "She'll freeze come November, and the horses will rot," McKittrick finally spat. Bitter she'd left his offer rotting in her hands. No one helped her. No one even rode out that far again except to gawk. But every night, Clara lit a lantern inside that barn, and it glowed soft under the slope, like something hiding from the world. The storm didn't come until February, and it came from the north. Not the usual western roll of black sky and snow, but a silent, creeping fog that bled down from the hills like a ghost. It swept fast and low, smothered the trails by morning, turned fence posts into buried stubs and barns into shallow mounds. It wasn't the cold that shocked people. It was the weight of it, how snow clung to roofs and walls like wet concrete, how wind found every crack in the wood, how cattle bellowed and fell, one by one, in stables that hadn't been emptied fast enough. McKittrick's prize stallion froze standing. The Vaughns lost 6 mules in one night. The Jasper boys' cattle stampeded through their own gate in panic and never came back. By the 4th day, men were breaking into sheds to burn tools for heat. One boy died of smoke inhalation. A mother lost 2 fingers trying to dig through snow to her pantry. Horses refused to breathe the air unless inside something warm. That's when someone, no one remembered who, said it out loud. "What about the buried barn?" At first it was laughed off, but by nightfall, 3 men had trudged out there. Vaughn, Jasper, and McKittrick, who'd lost half his herd. They didn't return until dawn, and they returned quiet. Because Clara's barn hadn't buckled. It hadn't shifted. The snow had buried it like a tomb, yes, but the door had been built into the slope behind it, hidden under an awning of carved stone and pine boughs. Inside it was dry, warm. Her 2 horses stood calmly tethered, their breath rising slow and white in the straw-heavy air. Along one wall was a stack of feed, on the other, a shelf of root vegetables. In the corner, a small wood stove, venting through a pipe that ran through the roof and out the back wall. And Clara herself stood by the stove, with a kettle in her hands, and said, "Leave your boots there. I'll show you where the hay's stored." They didn't ask how she built it, not that morning. They just dropped to their knees and began to weep. 3 more days of storm, 3 more bodies found frozen by February's end, and each night, the buried barn's light glowed dim from under the snow, like a warning or a promise. No one called it foolish anymore. By the time the storm relented on the 7th day, the snowbank stood nearly to a man's shoulders. Wagons vanished beneath it. The sheriff's office lost its porch. 2 chimneys collapsed from the weight alone. But the buried barn, Clara's crypt, as they once called it, stood firm under its sod-packed roof, its flue still puffing slow curls of smoke from beneath a snowdrift that now reached the eaves of her nearby cabin. She hadn't asked for visitors, and yet they kept coming. It began with the Vaughn brothers hauling a shivering calf, too weak to stand, cradled in a blanket like a newborn. Clara took it in without a word. The next day, McKittrick sent his foreman with 2 pregnant mares. Then a widow from town, Sarah Price, arrived on foot, dragging a sled with her last surviving goat and a basket of cracked corn. She didn't ask to stay, only if the goat could make use of Clara's straw. Clara didn't speak much. She never smiled, but she never said no. Soon the barn held not just horses, but chickens, dogs, even a pair of feral cats someone had caught from the woodpile behind the schoolhouse. Clara set up partitions using old feed sacks and canvas, rigging a labyrinth of warm, quiet stalls. She rationed her stove wood with brutal efficiency, never letting the fire go out but never wasting more than she had to. Somehow the air inside remained warm enough for breath not to to frost, and the animals, the ones that made it inside, stayed alive. By the end of the second week, the snow stopped falling, but the wind turned violent. It screamed across the open plains with the teeth of broken glass. Men tried to dig out stables only to find them caved in from the inside. Beams splintered, nails ripped from rotted timbers, roofs pancaked inwards as though stomped by some giant's boot. In one case, the walls of a barn had simply imploded. 2 oxen froze mid-struggle, locked together in the dark, their eyes still wide in terror. But the buried barn was untouched. There was no wind beneath the earth, no ice in the corners. The slope above it deflected the worst of the gusts, and the sod roof, now hardened under a thick sheet of frozen snow, acted like armor. Even the flue pipe curved at a downward angle before rising out through the wall, avoided blockage. Clara had carved a channel around it with the heel of a shovel each morning before dawn, packing ash around the base to keep it from icing over. And though some whispered it behind her back, few could deny it to her face. She had built better than any man in Sweet Hollow, better even than the Vaughan brothers' prized log barn, which had stood for 8 years until the snow caved its ridgepole in like a matchstick. She had no husband, no children, no neighbors before the storm, but by the 3rd week, Clara was the center of the town's quiet survival. People still didn't call her by name. They referred to her as the bride, or that woman up north. Yet when the sheriff's own roof gave in, and he had to leave town to fetch aid from the county seat, he rode out past her cabin first. And when he knocked, she opened the door, listened to his request, then stepped aside so he could come in and warm his hands before the journey. Her cabin was no larger than a shack. The walls were mud-chinked logs, low and dark. The floor was packed earth, but it was warm. It smelled of fresh bread, clean smoke, and the sharp tang of leather. A bucket of water sat unfrozen in the corner. A thick quilt, hand-stitched, lay folded near the hearth. "You'll make it," she said when he left. "If you don't stop moving." That was all. It was McKittrick who said what others only whispered. "She built it like that on purpose." He said it while leaning against the post of the general store, watching the townsfolk argue over who should go next to fetch help for the family trapped up the ravine. No one else volunteered. No one else dared the cold. She dug it down, sank it deep, packed the roof, used stone on the inside, knew where the wind hit from, so she set it into the hill. And that stove flue, it's angled so the heat doesn't escape. No drafts, no backflow, no sparks. Someone asked how he knew. "I walked the whole place that first night. She let me. Didn't say more than 10 words, but she knew exactly what she'd done." Another man muttered, "Why would she know to do that?" McKittrick just looked off toward the north ridge, where the wind carved angry scars across the horizon, and said, "Maybe she's buried animals before. Maybe she's buried people." There was no chapel in Sweet Hollow, only a small plank-walled meeting hall used for Sundays and voting. But by early March, someone left a candle burning there at night, next to a list of names, those confirmed dead and those still missing. On the 3rd Monday, a rider returned from the mountains with news of 4 more deaths: 2 children, a grandmother, and a farmer who'd gone back into his barn to find a missing lantern. His body was frozen under the doorframe. Clara read the list in silence when the names were brought to her. She offered no prayer, no sign of grief. But that night she lit 2 lanterns instead of one for the barn, one for the trail leading up to it. And come morning, a woman and her son arrived with a dog so thin its ribs showed through its coat. Clara opened the barn without a word. By the end of the month, the barn no longer looked like a barn. It looked like a sanctuary. Inside, the smell was ripe: hay, sweat, steam, smoke, but not foul. The straw was turned daily. The animals rotated between stalls. Even the chickens had a little corner blocked from drafts, with dry pine shavings and fresh scraps. Someone had hung herbs from a crossbeam, likely Sarah Price, to mask the smell. Someone else had left a Bible on a shelf. A boy strung twine between pegs to dry mittens. A woman washed rags in a bucket of warm water Clara had set aside. It was a barn in name only now. It was the last warm place left. Then came the melt, slow at first, subtle, a trickle beneath the snowdrifts, a shift in the wind. But then, over 2 days, the sun emerged with the force of spring vengeance. Ice cracked like gunshots in the trees. Snow began to sag and buckle. The fields turned to marsh, and that's when the other barns, the ones that hadn't yet collapsed, began to rot. Water seeped into the wood. Mold bloomed. Horses that had survived the cold now caught fever from the damp. Chickens drowned in puddles they mistook for feed pans. Rats emerged from crawl spaces, teeth gnashing. A dozen settlers lost what little they'd saved. But Clara's barn was dry. She'd laid stone beneath the floor, packed clay around the foundation, and dug a trench along the uphill side to divert runoff. The entire structure shed water like a duck's back. The slope carried melt away, and the sod roof absorbed the rest. When McKittrick came to see it again, this time with a limp and a frostbitten ear, he just stared at the walls and muttered, "It's a cave, not a barn. It's a damn fortress." She said nothing, but that night she added 3 more lanterns to the trail, because more were coming. They never learned where she'd come from. Rumors spread that she'd been widowed in Kansas, that she'd built dugouts with her father in the Dakota clay, that she'd once survived a prairie fire by hiding under wet earth for 3 days. Some even said she'd lived among the Shoshone or worked on the rail crews as a cook. But Clarabelamy never told. She never raised her voice, never asked for thanks. She just fed the animals, shoveled the walks, and when another widow asked if there was room for one more calf, she simply nodded and opened the gate. By April, the snow was gone, but the damage remained. Half the barns in Sweet Hollow were unsalvageable. Livestock was down by nearly 2/3. 7 families had moved east or south to join kin. 4 homesteads were abandoned outright. But Clara's barn still stood. Her animals still lived, and though spring sun now touched the slope above it, the barn remained cool, dry, and quiet. Ready, no one laughed anymore. They just came and knocked and asked, not for shelter now, but for advice. And Clarabelamy, the mail-order bride no one wanted, would step out from her buried barn, nod once and say, "I'll show you what I did." By spring, her name traveled further than her boots ever had. Clarabelamy's barn had gone from whispered embarrassment to legend in the making, and as the frost receded into slush and the ground unfroze just enough to show the bones of fences and homes alike, the survivors of Sweet Hollow started admitting the truth. They owed that woman their animals, their fingers, their lungs, and in more cases than any dared to say aloud, their lives. But with the thaw came a different kind of danger. It wasn't snow or ice anymore that threatened Sweet Hollow. It was rot. The thaw brought sickness. Old hay turned sour. Mold bloomed across dry goods stored improperly through the freeze. Tools warped from damp, boots peeled open at the soles. But worst of all were the lungs, shallow coughs, then deep ones, and then the long-winded, hacking kind that stole sleep from every house with a child inside. Pneumonia swept through the valley like a snake under floorboards. No one knew who brought it. They only knew where it didn't go: the buried barn. It wasn't just that it had stayed warm. It had stayed consistent. The earth around it regulated the temperature in a way the townsfolk were only now starting to understand. There were no wild temperature swings, no flooding, no black mold crawling up the walls. Inside it smelled of straw and wood smoke, not mildew and rot. And Clara, who still hadn't shared more than a few dozen words with anyone, had insisted from the start that every cloth, every boot, every pail be wiped clean before entry. "She knew," Sarah Price muttered once, as she wrung out a rag and laid it on the wood stove. "She didn't just guess. She knew this was coming." Sarah's daughter lay curled beside the stove, breathing slow, recovering from a fever that had nearly killed her. They'd brought her in 2 nights after her skin began to chill despite the heat. Clara hadn't blinked. She'd taken the girl straight into the cabin, boiled water, and pulled dried leaves from a pouch Sarah couldn't name. And now the girl was warm again. Her color had returned. She slept. Others weren't so lucky. 3 families buried loved ones that April: a boy, a midwife, a man too old to fetch firewood for himself. Clara dug one of the graves herself. When May arrived, so did the letters. A courier from Snake Ridge brought them, bundled and wax-sealed, slung in a damp saddlebag. Word had spread fast, faster than any would have thought possible. Ranchers from 2 counties over were writing to ask how Clara built her barn, whether she'd travel, whether she'd advise, whether she'd sell plans. She didn't, but she let others come. That was her rule. She wouldn't go to them. Too far, too late. Too fragile now, with the frost gone, but the ground not yet healed. But they could come to her, and they did. Within 2 weeks, a dozen men had arrived, each one muddy, worn thin, desperate. Some had sketchbooks, others brought blueprints, scrap paper with scribbled half-ideas of sloped walls and bermed roofs. They wanted to see her barn, measure it, trace it, understand it. Clara stood in the doorway, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, and told them plainly, "It's not just the building. It's the earth. She showed them the slope, how she'd read the wind in the first week, before even setting the foundation, how she'd packed clay with crushed straw to seal the walls, how the sod roof had been stitched like a quilt, not rolled like a rug. She pointed out how the rear ventilation pipe curved through an old hollowed-out log, not metal, not iron, but wood, to prevent condensation build-up in the freeze. When someone asked where she learned it, she only said, "From people who buried their food, not their families." That stopped questions cold, but the visitors kept coming. By June, a new sort of settler had begun arriving in Sweet Hollow, not looking for land, but for knowledge. They'd heard about the buried barn through letters, by word of mouth, through distant family who'd barely survived their own winter. A woman from Utah Territory arrived with a cart of drawings. A pair of brothers from Montana carried photographs wrapped in oilcloth. One man, old, wiry, missing 2 fingers, brought nothing but a single clay brick in his coat, hoping Clara could tell if it would hold heat the way hers did. She looked at it, turned it in her hand and said, "No, it's too porous." She gave him a better one, from a stack she'd made herself, sun-dried behind the barn, long before the freeze. No one knew when she'd made them, or how. She had no kiln, only a flat patch of ground behind the cabin, a pit near the creek, and a shovel she kept cleaner than her boots. In town, pride turned into embarrassment. The very people who had once called her Barn a tomb now couldn't look her in the eye without shame. They brought her things instead: pie, sugar, candles, books. A child gave her a chicken feather tied to a string. A man carved her a spoon. She accepted none of it, except the feather. She hung it in the barn above the stove. When someone asked her why that and not the rest, she replied, "That child lost her father, but she still wanted to give something. That means more than kindness." That night, the child's mother wept in front of Clara's door. She didn't ask for anything, just wept. Clara stood with her, not touching, not comforting, just standing, until the woman said, "He built a fine barn, but it didn't matter, did it? You built for the storm." "We built for the sun," Clara said, very quietly. "I built to remember." The sheriff returned in July, thinner, darker, worn down to the bone. But he brought news. Sweet Hollow would receive aid from Cheyenne, food stores, seed, timber for rebuilding, and they wanted to meet the woman who'd kept the livestock alive. They wanted to speak to the mail-order bride. Clara didn't go. She sent the sheriff back with a note, not long, not demanding, just a list. What was still needed: nails, salt, flour, saw blades, not for her, for the others. And at the bottom, one sentence written in a different hand: "Sarah prices. She won't take credit. She'll take help." The officials never came, but the supplies did. By harvest season, Sweet Hollow had changed. People dug deeper, built lower. They stopped mocking what they couldn't understand and started asking. They carved drainage channels, buried food stores, insulated roofs with earth instead of canvas, and every barn raised that fall had at least one feature borrowed, or outright copied, from Clarabelamy's buried masterpiece. She never charged a cent, never signed a single blueprint, but the children called her Miss Clara now, and that was more than she ever wanted. Still, she stayed silent. She watched. She built. When a boy fell through ice in early November and was pulled out gasping, she was the one who wrapped him in quilts by her stove. When McKittrick's new colt refused to nurse and grew weak in the cold, she mixed a bottle from powdered milk and honey and fed it by hand. When a windstorm knocked over the Vaughn's fence, she helped haul the rails upright with a pry bar and a length of rope that looked suspiciously like something she'd used as a harness. No one dared ask her age anymore. No one called her a widow. No one asked if she'd marry, because by then, it was understood. She wasn't here to be someone's wife. She was here to outlast the weather, and they would be fools not to follow her lead. Then came the second storm, late December. Not as long as the first, only 3 days, but more violent. The wind screamed like a banshee. Snow fell sideways. Ice struck like thrown glass. Trees cracked. The steeple bell was torn from its housing. 4 new barns collapsed. Clara's did not, because she'd rebuilt it that fall, deeper, stronger, reinforced with stone on the uphill side, a second flue with a weighted cap. A new drainage pit lined with baked brick and gravel she'd sifted herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was perfecting. And when the storm ended, her barn was the only place in the county with 2 healthy cows, a dry feed bin, and a roof you could stand on without falling through. So they came again, not in shame this time, in reverence. And Clara, still silent, still dry-eyed, still wrapped in the same worn coat and dark bonnet, looked out at the snow-smothered valley from her cabin door and said only, "There will be worse storms. Build for them." And that was the last thing she ever needed to say. The valley did not laugh anymore. By the second winter, no one called her the mail-order bride. No one muttered crypt builder beneath their breath, and no one mocked her sloped roof or sod-covered walls. Sweet Hollow had stopped mocking altogether. The town had become a place of quiet hands and watching eyes, a place where people measured wisdom in frost lines and counted their blessings in boards that didn't warp and smoke that didn't turn back down the flue. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about what it meant, a reckoning, a rebuke, a blueprint for surviving the New West. The untamed frontier was never gentle, but something had changed these past 2 years. The snow came sooner, the wind carried teeth. Settlers once confident in their designs now admitted what Clarabelamy had known from the start. The weather didn't care for pride. That winter began with a silence so deep it unnerved the oldest ranchers. A calm sky, a cold earth, and not a bird in the air. The mountains held their breath. Then, like a drawn bow snapping loose, the storm struck, sudden, brutal, and unlike anything before. This time, it didn't just snow. It rained first, a thick, icy drizzle that soaked everything, then froze solid within hours. Trees turned to glass, doors jammed in their frames, wagons became sculptures, and footsteps were death traps. After the freeze came the snow, heavy, wet, and endless. It buried what the ice hadn't already locked. Roofs strained, windows cracked, the temperature plunged overnight. No one waited for it to get worse. They came in droves, families with sleds, riders on half-lame horses, children pulled on blankets, their breath rattling in their chests. They didn't knock this time. They didn't ask. They came because they knew where survival was buried, in the earth, in the warmth, in the woman who had already endured the worst once. Clara was ready. She had dug a second entrance that autumn, a narrow tunnel off the rear slope, reinforced with stone and packed hay, just in case the front iced over. She'd pre-cut firewood into small uniform stacks, each tied with twine and labeled for burn rate. She had buckets of lard, beans, dried root, and lentils set aside beneath a tarp stitched from feed sacks. She had made space, cleared straw, built 3 new stalls, and repurposed 2 crates as nesting boxes. When the first family arrived, a mother, father, and infant wrapped in burlap, she wordlessly handed them a pot of broth and pointed to a patch of cleared floor by the stove. No speeches, no instructions, just room to breathe. By the end of the second night, more than 30 people slept in or around the buried barn. They came in waves, some injured, some barefoot, a few nearly unconscious. Clara directed them all, silently, efficiently, like someone orchestrating the innermost workings of a time-worn machine. Sarah Price and her daughter were among the first. They'd known to come early. Sarah took charge of rationing once more, organizing supplies, tending to the sick. The Vaughan brothers brought tools and built a second stove, jury-rigged from iron plates, and an old barrel. McKittrick, now half-deaf and white-haired, carried firewood every morning at dawn, dragging it behind him on a sled made from a broken door. They were no longer visitors. They were extensions of Clara's plan. And Clara, she was everywhere, hammering loose planks, feeding a trembling colt, stoking the fire every 2 hours. She never slept more than a few minutes at a time. When someone asked her why she didn't rest, she answered flatly, "The roof rests, I don't." Children clung to her skirts. Men obeyed her nods. One girl, no more than 4, tried to braid Clara's hair as she leaned over the stove. Clara didn't stop her. When a boy's fever climbed dangerously, Clara sat beside him with a cloth of boiled willow bark and murmured something no one could hear. He woke the next day, coughing but alive. "Angel," someone whispered later. "That woman's not from this world." But she was, and she made sure they remembered it. Because when 2 men began arguing over who got the last stretch of cleared bedding near the stove, Clara stepped between them with a look so cold it cut through the heat. "If you'd built like I told you last year," she said without raising her voice, "you wouldn't be here now." Neither man spoke again. Outside, barns groaned and snapped. Wind moaned through broken beams like ghosts weeping for their own failures. Chickens froze on the roost. A pig turned rigid in a root cellar. A boy who hadn't reached Clara's slope in time was found face down in a drift, arms outstretched toward the lantern that had always glowed on her trail. They buried him behind the barn. Clara marked the spot with a flat stone. "I'll plant over it," she said. "Spring will come, and he'll be part of it." No one questioned her. The storm passed on the 7th day. The world outside looked like it had been wiped clean. Trees bowed under ice. Smoke curled low and slow from the few chimneys still standing. But the buried barn remained untouched, the snowpack above it carved neatly to one side by runoff, the slope channeled precisely as Clara had intended. By then, her design was more than just shelter. It was the town's inheritance. She began sketching it by lantern light, not for herself, but for others. She drew every inch, the angle of the walls, the composition of the sod, the depth of the trench, even the way to stack stones to support the roof. She made 7 copies, one for each family who had lost everything again. She refused to sign them. "Don't remember who," she said. "Remember why." The townsfolk complied. Those sketches were copied, passed along, shared with riders from as far away as Colorado and Idaho. One reached as far as Missouri, another ended up in the hands of a widow homesteading along the Canadian line. Clara never traveled, but her barn did. By the 3rd spring, Sweet Hollow had changed for good. It wasn't a town anymore, not in the traditional sense. It was a place of earth-sheltered homes, of curved rooftops and partially buried root cellars, of smoke that curled sideways instead of up, vented low and slow through trench flues modeled after the one behind Clara's stove. It was a place that knelt to nature, not one that challenged it. No buildings stood above shoulder height. No barn had 4 straight walls. Every child knew how to check a ceiling beam for pressure, how to test a flue with a feather, how to read the wind before building anything permanent. The sheriff returned again in late spring, this time with a federal surveyor. They wanted to document what Clara had done. A model of frontier innovation, they called it. Clara let them in. They measured, sketched, asked questions. She answered simply. No embellishment, no legend-making, just stone and straw and slope, heat and draft and breath. The laws of survival, not the fantasy of pioneers. They offered her money. She declined. They asked if she'd speak in Cheyenne. She said, "There's nothing there I need." When the surveyor left, he wrote a report that described Clara's barn as a masterwork of passive insulation and terrain utilization. He used the word brilliant 3 times. He never used the word bride. Then one morning, Clara was gone. Not missing, just gone. The barn door was latched, the stove still warm. A pot of beans sat on the coals. Her coat hung by the cabin door, but her boots were gone. Her bonnet, too. They found her tracks leading up the ridge behind the barn, through the old mule trail, across the frozen creek and into the pines. No return trail, no sign of a struggle, no note, just a single set of steps heading into the hills. Some said she went to find her past. Others believed she knew another storm was coming, one that wouldn't be survived. Sarah Price kept the barn going. The Vaughan brothers made improvements, a new smokehouse beside it, and a second entrance tunneled from the cabin. McKittrick, now nearly blind, sat beside the stove every morning and told stories to children who would never know the town before Clara. They called it Clara's Hollow. Now, not Sweet Hollow. The name stuck. Years later, after the railroad finally laid tracks close enough to bring real travel and trade, a writer came to town. He asked for stories, for legends, for names. They gave him one, Clarabelamy. He asked where she lived. They pointed to the slope, to the buried barn. She built for the storm, the writer was told. He asked if she was real. Sarah, now grey and leaning on her daughter's arm, answered flatly, "Does it matter?" The writer left unsatisfied, but Clara remained, in the earth, in the walls, in every stone-packed corner and sod-covered roof, in every child who knew to build down before building up. She had not left them. She had simply gone where the storms couldn't follow. Years passed. Clarabelamy's name faded from daily use, but her barn didn't. It stood as if grown from the hillside itself, silent, low, weather-worn, and moss-draped, but firm, a part of the landscape now, like the stones underfoot or the wind through the ravine. Children who had been babes in arms during the first great storm now walked the slope themselves, feeding animals or carrying buckets, asking questions their parents still didn't know how to answer. Why does it never flood? Why is it warmer inside than out, even without fire? Where did Miss Clara go? No one had an answer to the last, but the first 2, those they could explain now, with diagrams. With memory, with reverence, they taught their children how to read the slope, how to listen to the wind, how to pack clay until it cured like stone. But more than anything, they taught caution, humility, and foresight, the gospel Clara had preached without ever raising her voice. The buried barn became more than shelter. It became scripture. On the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, a second barn was built on the south edge of the valley. This one not by Clara, but by a boy who had once slept under her stove the night his father froze. He was 17 now, hands large and knotted like old wood, face browned from summer planting. He built it with help, yes, but the design was unmistakably hers. He dug it 3 feet down, laid stone, packed the walls with clay and dried grass, ventilated the stove at a curve, lined the feed racks with burlap, covered the roof in sod and snow thatch, built it not for show, but for silence. When it was done, Sarah Price, now frail and quiet-eyed, visited the site. She walked the length of it once, slowly, ran her hand along the outer wall, listened. Then she said, "It's right." He didn't ask how she knew. The storms kept coming, as Clara had warned they would, sometimes early, sometimes late. One came after the first thaw, catching everyone with waterlogged roofs and green buds just beginning to open. That one took a dozen new settlers, those who hadn't learned Clara's lessons and tried to build cabins like the ones back east. They were buried before they had names. But those in the hollow, those who built with the slope, who buried half their walls and insulated with dirt, who let the earth keep them instead of challenging it, those people endured. And in spring they planted, and in fall they gathered, and every winter they lit lanterns at the head of the trail to Clara's barn, though she never returned. 15 years after she left, her cabin burned. No one knew why. A lightning strike, perhaps, or a chimney spark finally taking hold after decades of resisting. By the time anyone reached it, the roof was gone, and the walls were blackened husks. The fire didn't touch the barn, too far downhill, too well placed, but the cabin collapsed into itself. The townsfolk wept, not for the loss of things. Clara had taken nothing with her when she vanished, and left nothing behind but her coat and a kettle, but for what the place had meant. That little cabin had held a rhythm, a silence, a center of gravity no church could match. They didn't rebuild it. Instead, they left the ash where it lay, cleared the brush and planted a circle of saplings around the ruins. Spruce mostly, fast-growing, resilient, the kind Clara might have approved of. Unglamorous, steady, unbending in storms. They called it the ring. Every spring, they cleared the undergrowth. Every winter, they shoveled a path to it. Some left offerings, feathers, stones, folded notes. A girl once placed a single braid of her own hair there. No one touched it. The ring was sacred now, not in the holy sense, but in the memory sense, in the bone-deep understanding that sometimes the world gives you one person who shows you how to survive it, and you do not forget them. You build their name into the walls. When the railroad finally reached the edge of Sweet Hollow, a new wave of settlers arrived. Men and women hardened by drought, fire, war. Some came from Kansas, others from the hills beyond Missouri, and a few from as far as Georgia and the Carolina pines. They brought with them brick and saws and ambition. They started laying straight-line roads, leveling hills, cutting trees the old settlers had left alone. They didn't understand the valley's silence, its slow rhythm, its hushed reverence. And for a time, tension grew. The old families, Vaughns, Prices, McKittrick's great-nieces, bristled. But then the first storm came. Not a terrible one, but hard enough to snap beams and flood basements. The new barns folded. The old ones, buried deep, built low, vented slow, stayed warm and dry. And in the morning, when the newcomers emerged shivering and soaked, they found baskets at their doors, dry bread, salt, wood shavings, and, in some cases, diagrams, folded blueprints drawn by hand, passed down from family to family, copies of Clara's barn. No notes, no judgment, just help. And so the newcomers learned. One of them, a young woman named Beatrice Holloway, took particular interest. She came from Tennessee, had been orphaned at 16, and could read better than most men in town. She was curious, sharp-tongued, and braver than she was wise. She found the buried barn within her first week and stood in front of it, arms crossed, lips curled. "That's it?" she said aloud. Sarah's granddaughter, tending goats nearby, only nodded. Beatrice laughed until she stepped inside. It was cold that morning. A stiff wind blew off the ridge. But the moment Beatrice ducked into the barn's low doorway, she felt the shift. The warmth, the silence, the steadiness. She didn't say a word for a long time. Then she asked, "Where's the rest of it?" The girl replied, "That is the rest of it." Beatrice came back every day for a week. Then she started drawing, then building. 6 months later, she finished a small root cellar behind her cabin, patterned exactly after Clara's original tunnel. By fall, she'd built a feed house with an insulated roof. By the second winter, she'd begun teaching others. By the third, she was Sweet Hollow's new builder. She never met Clara, but her hands learned the woman's rhythms, and that was enough. Eventually, people stopped wondering whether Clara was dead or alive. She had passed into something else, a kind of legend, yes, but not the exaggerated kind. Her story was told in facts, not fables. No one claimed she turned to snow. No one claimed her ghost guarded the barn. There were no songs, only things like, "She built for the slope. She didn't let wind touch her roof. She knew the storm before the sky did. And always, she left the door open, because even after she vanished, no one ever found that barn locked. Not once. That door stayed open every winter, and it still does. On the 20th winter since she left, a blizzard struck harder than any before. Winds clocked at 70 miles an hour. Snow rose over the ridge. The trees bent sideways, and the newer houses, even the ones built well, creaked in their bones. They lost power, water. The telegraph lines went down. For 4 days, no one could move. But inside the buried barn, 67 people gathered. Children and elders, ranchers and carpenters, strangers from outlying posts who'd been warned by the old-timers. If the sky turns wrong, follow the ridge trail. Look for the lantern. There was stew in the pot, straw on the floor, dry wood, blankets, and that same gentle warmth. No one froze, no one died, and when the storm ended and they stepped outside to find half the valley under drifts higher than rooftops, they didn't mourn, they nodded, they shoveled, they began again, because Clara had taught them how, not just to survive, but to stay. Time sanded the valley down to silence again. The forests grew back over the scars left by storms. The wind still carved through Sweet Hollow, still moaned in the trees like something half buried and half alive. But the people didn't flinch anymore. They'd lived through too much to fear noise. Their fear had become more refined, like Clara's had been, a fear of forgetting. That was what they guarded against now. It wasn't the cold, not anymore. It was amnesia, hubris, generations drifting away from what Clara had known in her bones. So every winter they told the story again. Not all of it, not at once, but in pieces, the way her barn had been built, a stone here, a sod slab there. Someone would tell the children about how Clara dug down before she built up. Another would tell them about the tunnel entrance no outsider ever noticed. Someone else would speak of the night 30 souls lay shoulder to shoulder in the buried warmth, their breath fogging in the lamplight, alive because one woman had read the ground better than any preacher had read scripture. And then a hush would follow, always, as if her presence hadn't entirely left. It was 73 years after Clara vanished when the boy named Abel McKittrick, her old suitor's great-grandson, did the one thing no one had dared in all that time. He opened the wall, not the barn's exterior, no. That stayed intact, sacred, but the north interior wall, the one facing the slope, the only wall Clara had always kept sealed, not boarded exactly but packed, with stone and clay, then covered with planks cut from logs so old no one could match their grain. She'd sealed it herself, back in the first winter. Abel wasn't careless. He was a builder, careful and gentle, raised on stories of Clara and her barn, the way others were raised on scripture and war. He'd built half the new homes in Sweet Hollow by the time he was 25, and he never used blueprints. He just walked the land, stared at the trees, touched the ground, and listened. Some said he had her blood, though no one could prove it. He claimed he only wanted to understand how the back wall was braced, whether it was structural or cosmetic, whether it needed reinforcement after the last quake. But when he chipped through the outermost clay layer, he didn't find timber. He found a space, empty, sealed, dry. Inside it was a small alcove, barely the size of a cupboard, but perfectly square, lined with stone, capped with a single timber arch that had not bowed a hair. And in the center, wrapped in oiled cloth and resting atop 2 bricks, was a bundle. They unwrapped it in silence. Sarah Price's granddaughter was there. So was Beatrice Holloway's youngest son. Abel's own wife, Ruth, brought the lantern closer. The cloth peeled back like skin. Inside were 5 things: a spool of thread, a flat rock with a child's initials scratched into it, a feather still tied to string, a sketch, Clara's original drawing, the blueprint she'd copied again and again for others, drawn in thin, precise lines on the back of a flour sack, and a letter. The ink had faded. The paper was hand-pressed, rough to the touch, but it was hers. No one doubted that. It read, "If you are reading this, the storms have come again, and if they've come again, then you know by now that I did not build this place for myself. I built it because the world does not wait for permission. It takes what it can. It devours pride and punishes beauty, and it doesn't care what you plan to be, only what you've prepared to face. I wasn't brave. I was ready. That's the whole truth of it. Teach the children. Build into the earth. Let the cold come." That was all. She hadn't signed it. She hadn't needed to. They resealed the wall. Abel insisted on doing it himself. No help, no shortcuts. He packed the clay slowly, layer by layer, the way she must have on her knees all those decades ago. Then he pressed the final stone in place and covered it with a timber slab shaped to match the old grain. When he was done, he didn't speak for a long time. He only said, "We won't open it again," and no one did. After that, the valley changed once more, not in shape, not in habit, but in tone. The buried barn became a true shrine, not a museum. Clara would have hated that, but a lived-in relic, still used, still needed, but spoken of with care, not just gratitude. No one left tools inside anymore. No one stored extra grain or stray buckets. The barn was for warmth, for breath, for lives. And above the door, they carved her name, just once, just simply, Clara. No surname, no dates, just Clara, because that was enough. Seasons passed like they always did, slow, then sudden, merciful, then cruel. One summer brought fire, dry lightning that cracked the forest edge, swept down the ridge. The flames licked the air and scorched bark black. But they never touched the barn. The slope turned the flames, the sod roof dampened the embers, and the earth, as it always had, protected its own. Another winter brought wind so violent it shattered glass in the town's few remaining upright windows. But inside the barn, lanterns flickered steady. The wind couldn't find its way inside. The barn had been built with the storm in mind, and the storm, at long last, seemed to respect it. Eventually, historians came, proper ones this time. Professors, engineers, architects. They had notebooks, tripods, cameras with brass fittings. They measured soil temperatures, took core samples. One man even tried to 3D map the airflow with smoke and mirrors. None of it worked. The barn refused to give up its secrets. Not because it was unknowable, but because it had never been designed by equation or formula. It had been shaped by instinct, by survival, by one woman's refusal to build what everyone else built. They left with data, but no wisdom. Wisdom stayed in the valley, in the hands of girls who shaped bricks in spring, and boys who stacked stones in fall, in the way elders watched the wind roll down the slope and said, "Wait another day before planting," in the stories passed like seeds, not written down but spoken low and soft by lantern light, and in the buried barn, still warm, still dry, still alive. Then, long after anyone thought to expect such a thing, someone saw her, not in town, not in the barn, not close at all. A trapper, half-starved and delirious, wandered into Sweet Hollow from the northern forest. He was missing 2 fingers, his feet wrapped in rags, and his words barely made sense. But he said again and again that a woman in black had pulled him from a ravine. She said, he whispered, eyes bloodshot, she said to follow the river south, said the light was still there, said they would remember her. He didn't know the name Clara. But when shown the sketch, the only one drawn of her, sketched from memory years ago by Sarah's daughter, the man pointed and said, "That's her, that's who saved me." No one knew what to make of it. By then she would have been over 100, but not one person laughed. Because even if it wasn't real, even if it was just the last wish of a dying man's mind, it meant something had endured. The idea of her, the shape of her story, her trail in the snow, and maybe that was enough. The buried barn still stands. It has outlived every stable in the territory, outlasted wind, fire, snow, and the forgetting that eats most places from the inside out. People still light lanterns on the slope every first snow. Children still duck inside on cold nights, just to feel how quiet it is. Women still nod when they pass the doorway, as if greeting someone who still watches. And when the cold comes hard, the kind that kills chickens on the roost and makes nails bend from frost, the people of Sweet Hollow don't panic. They gather, they open the door, they step inside. Because one woman built for the storm, and that was how they learned to stay. The oldest man in Sweet Hollow had a map drawn on leather, tanned deer hide, roughly cut, the edges curled like dried bark, and every inch was covered in burnt marks and faded ink strokes, not of roads, not of county lines, but of the wind. Arrows, swirls, slopes. It had been made by his grandfather's hand, he said, using a hot nail and a piece of coal. But the shapes weren't random. They mirrored the ridge. They mirrored the way Clarabelamy had once walked the land, stopping, crouching, pressing a palm into frost-stiff soil, tilting her head to listen to the trees. That old man, name of Jonah, kept the map in a crate beneath his bed, wrapped in wax cloth and quilt batting. And once each year, when the first snow fell hard enough to bury a man's boots, he'd unroll it in front of the young ones. "This," he'd say, "is how she knew." She read the valley like scripture. The wind wasn't her enemy, it was her blueprint. He would trace one curl of ink with a fingertip the size of a walnut. She said, "Never build where the gusts break the pines. Build where they settle. Build in the hush." That hush was the secret, not just the slope, not just the stone or sod, but the silence of the air, where sound didn't whip or howl, but curled and held its breath, where heat wouldn't flee, where smoke wouldn't fight to rise. It was in that hush she'd built. It was in that hush they still survived. The buried barn had no plaque, no museum hours, no chain across its doorway or docent to explain its parts. And yet, pilgrims still came, not the kind with crosses or incense, the kind with rope-burned hands, threadbare gloves, and questions no city could answer. They came from the Dakotas, from Alberta, from the Badlands and the Black Hills. Some walked, some rode mules. One woman came barefoot, her boots stolen weeks before in a fire. She knelt outside the barn for 2 hours before stepping inside, afraid she might bring bad luck with her. The boy who watched the barn that season, a boy named Eli, with a voice like dry straw and eyes too big for his face, had simply said, "She never locked it. You're welcome." That woman slept in the barn for 4 nights and left with nothing but a handful of Clara's clay from the wall, pressed into a small wooden box. She said she wanted to bury it back home, that maybe it'd remind her land how to behave. One year, a man came with a book, leather-bound, handwritten, nearly 200 pages long. It was filled with copied sketches of buried barns, low-roofed homes, storm-sunk sheds, earth-insulated coops. He had walked from barn to barn across 5 territories, tracing the lineage of one design, Clara's. Some had altered it. Some had misunderstood it, but the bones were always there, the slope, the insulation, the breathing flue. At the center of his book, he had placed a hand-drawn copy of the original buried barn plan, sketched from a photograph taken 40 years after Clara had disappeared. The barn's shape was unmistakable, a low, sloped triangle, like a wedge sunk into the hill, with only a door and stovepipe to mark it. He left the book in Sweet Hollow, didn't even ask for thanks, just nodded once to Jonah, who was watching from a bench, and said, "She was smarter than all of us. Maybe if I copy her enough times, I'll understand why." Jonah nodded. "Copy the humility first, the rest will follow." That winter was the worst in 40 years. Started with a thaw, then snapped into a freeze so sudden the trees crackled in the night like musket fire. Ice buried wells, shutters flew off hinges, whole herds stampeded through fences just to find shelter from a sky that looked like shattered glass. 2 cabins collapsed before the sun rose. People came running, some on sleds, some on foot, some dragging goats, children, sleds, even chickens stuffed into sacks. No one asked, no one waited. They turned toward the slope, toward the lantern already lit, toward the doorway built low and strong. Eli was still keeper that year. He'd been taught by Beatrice's son, who had been taught by Sarah, who'd been taught by Clara herself, not in words, but in watching. He opened the barn and stepped aside. They came, and they lived. The barn was fuller than ever that week, 71 souls, not counting the animals. A few chickens, a calf, a goat, 4 dogs, even a crow that wouldn't leave the eaves. People slept head to foot, chest to shoulder, bundled like roots under earth. The stove never went out. They took shifts, feeding it, tending to the pots, wiping condensation from the walls, rotating the sleeping so no one froze at the edge. The silence inside wasn't somber. It was holy, not the silence of grief, but the silence of awe. The kind of silence where you felt safe, where nothing outside could reach you, where Clara's breath still seemed to linger in the warmth between stone and straw. That spring, they held the first true gathering in her name. Not a funeral, not a sermon, just a day, a remembering. They cleared the slope, cleaned the flue, replaced cracked timber with hewn oak, repacked the clay with fresh mud from the stream, mixed with sawdust and straw like Clara had done with her own hands. The children pressed their palms into the wet clay, one by one, leaving smudged handprints along the interior wall. No words were spoken during that part. No one dared. Later they sang. Old songs, slow ones. Songs about the wind and the dirt and the way a body bends when it has to hold others. One woman read Clara's letter aloud again, the one found behind the sealed wall. When she reached the line, "I wasn't brave, I was ready." Everyone bowed their heads. A little girl, no more than 5, whispered to her mother, "Was she ever scared?" And her mother, with tears in her eyes, whispered back, "She must have been, but she built anyway." The following year, a storm took a neighboring town clean off the map. Timbers scattered, roofs gone, barns flattened. Only one family survived, a widow and her 3 children, because they'd dug a partial shelter the year before, copying a plan passed to them by a distant cousin from Sweet Hollow. That partial shelter held. The widow came to Sweet Hollow weeks later, not to cry, not to ask for help, but to see where the plan had come from. She sat in front of the buried barn for hours, said nothing, just pressed her hands to the wall. Then she took a single rock from the path and said, "My daughter will carry this when she grows up. She'll teach her babies how to build down." Then she left. No one asked her name, but they made sure the path to the barn stayed clear after that. Every year, every storm. Eventually, no one remembered who first called it the buried barn. It was just the barn now, not in a possessive sense. Not Clara's barn, just the barn, the one, the place, the center. If you needed to breathe, you went there. If you needed to remember how to survive, you stood in its doorway and looked out at the slope, at the wind bending the grass, at the trees that leaned east, even though storms mostly came from the north. If you needed warmth, or silence, or proof that one good thing could outlast 100 bad ones, you ducked your head and stepped inside. And if you stayed quiet long enough, you might feel it. The hush, the one Clara had built into every wall, the one that meant you were still alive. The final storm came in silence. No thunder, no wind, no curtain of snow sweeping over the ridge like in the old days. Just a deepening gray in the sky, like the sun had blinked and forgotten to open its eye again. Then the air thickened. Stillness settled on the land like a hand pressed down on the chest of the world. No birds flew. The creek stopped babbling. Even the dogs refused to bark. In Sweet Hollow, people paused mid-chore. Men looked up from tool benches. Women paused in laundry. Children stopped running mid-game and turned instinctively toward the slope. Something was coming. No one needed to say it aloud. They simply moved, deliberate, practiced, just like Clara had shown them. Wood was carried, water was fetched, doors shuttered, paths to the barn were cleared with shovels and gloved hands. Lanterns were lit and set along the trail like they always were when the sky turned. But this time, they lit everyone, all the way down the ridge, because this time they could feel it would be different. Eli was an old man by then. His back bent like a sapling under snow. His hands trembled when he carried the lantern to the barn's door. But his mind was sharp, his memory long. He'd been there as a boy when the woman with frostbitten feet was saved. He remembered Jonah's map, the letter behind the wall, the quiet in the barn that never failed. He hadn't left the slope in 15 years. Now, he lit the final lantern and said to no one, "This one's hers." Then the snow began to fall, not in flakes, in sheets. Thick as wool, fast as rain, heavy as wet stone. Within minutes, it swallowed the treetops. Within hours, it erased every fence line. By morning, it had buried the first houses past their windows. By noon, chimneys disappeared, and still it fell. But the people of Sweet Hollow were not afraid. They followed the trail. It wasn't panic that brought them. It wasn't desperation. It was reverence. They came bundled in blankets, shouldering sleds, leading horses and goats and coughing children. They came with quiet voices and full hands, bread, beans, buckets, bricks. Every single family that had once scoffed at the buried barn now brought something for it, not as payment, as offering. By the second night, the barn held 96 souls. By the third, over 100. The stove burned hot, then slow. Heat moved through the walls the way Clara had always intended. Not rushing, not bleeding out, but soaking. The walls breathed, the air circulated, the flue drew clean, and the silence remained. The hush, the warmth, the breath of survival. Eli sat by the stove, wrapped in the same coat he'd worn since boyhood, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Do you think," one girl asked him, "she built this knowing it'd get this bad?" He smiled barely. "She built this knowing it might. That's what matters." And she nodded, as if understanding something even her parents hadn't said aloud. Outside, the storm carved the valley into a white ocean. Homes collapsed, trees splintered, barns not built low enough or strong enough folded under the weight like paper. One family, newcomers, had tried to stay in their home, certain it would hold. They were found 2 days later, alive, but barely. It was the heat from Clara's barn that brought them back, that and the silence. Not a silence of death, a silence of protection. On the 5th night, a child was born in the barn, not planned, not early, but not feared either. A midwife was there. Blankets were warm. Water was boiled over coals Clara had once set aside. Not literally, of course, but the same pile, same plan, same rhythm. The child's first cry echoed through the rafters, then quiet again. Then someone wept, not out of fear, not grief, but joy, to know that even here, even now, even while the world howled and bent and buried itself, life had the audacity to begin again. They named the baby Clara. No one objected. The storm broke on the 6th day. Sun didn't return, not fully, but light began to bleed through the snow-thick sky. The wind let up, the drifts settled, and for the first time since it began, people stepped to the barn's doorway and saw a world still out there, waiting. Sweet Hollow wasn't intact, but it had endured. The cabins were crushed, the fences lost, the fields erased, but no lives were taken, not one, because Clara had built for this. That spring, the town did something it had never done before. They held a ceremony, not in the church, which was gone, not in the meeting hall, which had been used for firewood. They held it in front of the buried barn, on the slope, with the sod turning green again and the creek whispering below. They brought stories, bread, a single lantern, and one by one, each family, old and new, laid a stone on the path. Smooth ones, marked ones. A child painted hers yellow. A man carved his initials into one. The midwife placed hers next to the doorframe, where Clara's had once stood. No one said a sermon. No one read a verse. But someone began to hum, an old tune, no words, just the slow, steady sound of breath turned into rhythm. It was enough. The buried barn became more than legend after that. It became curriculum. Children in other towns studied its design. Builders copied it. Even rail towns with telegraph wires and new iron roofs started mimicking its layout. Some hired engineers. Others asked for copies of Clara's original sketch. They didn't always follow it perfectly, but the principle held: build with the storm in mind. Trust the ground. Let the wind pass over you, not through you. Insulate with what the world gives freely: stone, sod, slope, silence. And above all, leave the door open. That was always the last part. Never closed, never locked. It was not a barn if it kept people out. When Eli died years later, they buried him near the cabin ruins, under a spruce grown tall and wide since the days Clara planted it as a sapling. They marked his grave with a stone shaped like the corner of the barn, triangular, rough, perfect. The same shape that had saved them all again and again. And on that stone they carved one word: listen, because Clara had, to the land, to the wind, to the quiet, and that was how she knew. Now, 100 years later, when travelers come through the high valleys and ask about the low building buried into the hillside, with the grass growing thick across its roof and the trail lined with stones like a prayer in motion, they're told, that's not just a barn. That's how we're still here. That's Clara's answer to every storm the world will ever throw at us. And it's not just made of stone and sod. It's made of silence, survival, and the knowledge that building something to last, really last, means building something that welcomes others in, especially when the snow comes, especially when the wind howls, especially when everything else has broken. So the barn still stands, low and quiet. It breathes when the frost does, and when the sky darkens and the trees bow low and the first heavy flakes begin to fall, the trail to its door lights up one lantern at a time, each one placed by hand, each one glowing like a heartbeat, because someone always remembers, someone always listens, and someone always opens the door.